Good evening. There is a specific kind of madness that takes hold of empires when they enter their twilight. It is not the madness of the chaotic scream, but the madness of the sleepwalker. A calm, bureaucratic, structured march toward the abyss. We are witnessing a moment that future historians, if there are any future historians to write the books, will look back upon with a mixture of horror and bewilderment. We see missiles flying deep into Russian territory. We see the Kremlin unveiling hypersonic threats that belong in a science fiction dystopia. We see the White House responding with the sterile, managed language of a press release, as if they are discussing a tariff on aluminium rather than the potential incineration of civilization. It reminds me of the ancient Greek tragedies, specifically the Persians by Aeschylus. The tragedy was not just about war, it was about hubris. It was about the inability of powerful men to see that by pulling the string of fate too tight, they eventually snap the neck of the very society they claim to protect. Today, we are going to look behind the curtain of this latest escalation. We are going to ignore the hysterical headlines for a moment and ask the dangerous questions. Why now? Who benefits? And why does the adult response from the West feel so utterly devoid of actual adulthood? We are not just watching a geopolitical chess game. We are watching the spasms of a dying economic order, desperate to maintain its grip through the only mechanism it has left, organized violence. Let us look at the facts on the ground, stripped of the propaganda varnish. Ukraine, armed with Western long-range missiles, ATAK-MS, Storm Shadows, has struck deep into the Russian interior. This is a crossed red line. For months, we were told this would not happen. And then, as if by magic, the permission is granted. Why? Because the battlefield logic demanded it. Or because the political calendar in Washington demanded it. In response, Vladimir Putin, a man whose authoritarianism I have spent years critiquing, did exactly what a predictable autocrat does. He escalated. He fired the Oreshnik, a hypersonic ballistic missile capable of carrying nuclear warheads at Dnipro. It was a message. It was a theatrical display of raw power intended to say, I can hit you and you cannot stop it. And what does the White House say? They issue strong warnings. They speak of ironclad commitments. They double down. They tell us that the only path to peace is to pour more gasoline on the fire. The media consumes this linearly, action, reaction, strike, counter-strike, but this is not a linear story. This is a systemic loop. We are stuck in a feedback loop of distraction, where the escalation is the product. To understand why this is happening, we must stop thinking like military strategists and start thinking like political economists. We must look at the structural reality of the United States and the European Union. For decades, I have argued that the American hegemony was built on the global minotaur, the ability of the US to recycle the world's profits into Wall Street to fund its twin deficits. But that beast is wounded. The US economic dominance is no longer based on production. It is based on financialization and the weaponization of the dollar. When an empire loses its economic vitality, it turns to its military supremacy. It is the last lever. The United States cannot outproduce China in green energy. It cannot outbuild the global South in infrastructure. But it can outgun everyone. This war in Ukraine, tragic as it is, serves a functional purpose for a declining hegemon. It creates a fault line. It forces Europe, my poor, pathetic, irrelevant Europe, into total subservience. Before this war, there was a chance, however slim, of Eurasian integration, of energy from the East meeting technology from the West. That nightmare for Washington has been destroyed. The Nord Stream pipelines were not just steel tubes. They were the umbilical cord of a potential rival power bloc. Now Europe is purely a vassal state, buying expensive American LNG, buying American weapons, and hollowing out its own industries. And Russia? Let us be clear. Putin's invasion was criminal, but it was also the reaction of a reactionary regime that saw itself being cornered. It is the logic of the mafia don who feels his territory is being encroached upon. The tragedy is that the West, instead of offering a diplomatic off-ramp, spent 30 years celebrating the humiliation of post-Soviet Russia, nurturing the very monsters they now claim to fight. But there is a deeper layer here. If you read my recent work, you know I believe we have moved beyond capitalism. We have entered techno-feudalism. In traditional capitalism, profits were driven by markets. In techno-feudalism, power is driven by cloud capital, the digital fiefdoms of Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and the defense tech sector. Look at this war. It is the first true war of the techno-feudal age. Who are the winners? It is not just Raytheon and Lockheed Martin anymore. It is Starlink, it is Palantir, it is the companies that harvest the data of the battlefield to train their AI algorithms. The destruction of Ukrainian cities provides the training data for the next generation of automated warfare. The cloudalists, the new lords of our era, thrive on this instability. When supply chains break, Amazon consolidates more power. When fear rises, the surveillance state expands, powered by big tech. The central banks play their part too. They print the money that funds the deficits that buy the missiles. This creates asset inflation that enriches the oligarchy, while the working class in Ohio, in Manchester, in Lyon, pays for it through the silent tax of inflation and stagnating wages. This escalation is not just about territory. It is about maintaining a state of global emergency that allows cloud capital to bypass democracy entirely. Let's look at the players on this stage with a cruel, honest eye. The United States, the exhausted empire, the Biden administration, and the incoming Trump administration. Do not fool yourselves. They are two heads of the same eagle. Uses Ukraine as a proxy to weaken a geopolitical rival without bleeding American soldiers. It is a cynical, brutal calculus. They are willing to fight to the last Ukrainian to maintain the illusion of the rules-based international order, an order that applies to everyone else, but never to them. The European Union, oh the embarrassment. The European leadership has displayed a level of cowardice that is breathless. Germany, the industrial engine is dismantling itself. We have leaders in Brussels who behave like press secretaries for the Pentagon. They have no strategy. They have no autonomy. They are cheering for a war on their own border that destroys their own economy. It is suicidal. Russia, the tragic villain. Putin acts out of a combination of great Russian chauvinism and genuine paranoia. But by invading, he fell into the trap. He strengthened NATO. He justified the existence of the very alliance he hates. He has turned Russia into a junior partner, a vassal of China. The financiers. BlackRock is already lining up to reconstruct Ukraine. The vultures are circling the corpse before the heart has even stopped beating. They don't care about democracy. They care about assets. I want you to pause and ask yourself a question that the mainstream media refuses to ask. Where are the diplomats? In the height of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union and the US had thousands of nuclear weapons pointed at each other, they talked. Kennedy and Khrushchev talked. Nixon and Brezhnev talked. Today, silence. Total arrogant silence. Why is negotiation a dirty word? Why is ceasefire treated as treason? Because peace is bad for business. Peace exposes the cracks in the system. If there is peace, we have to talk about why the NHS is underfunded. We have to talk about why housing is unaffordable. We have to talk about the climate catastrophe. But if there is war, then we must unite. We must sacrifice. We must funnel billions into the abyss. War is the ultimate distraction from the failure of our economic system. And frankly, the incompetence would be funny if it weren't so deadly. You watch these press conferences, you see the spokesperson for the State Department or the NATO Secretary General. They stand there in their tailored suits with their perfect hair, using words like strategic ambiguity and kinetic action. They talk about nuclear brinkmanship with the same emotional detachment one uses to order a latte. I'll have a grande escalation with a shot of hazelnut, please. They genuinely believe they can control the uncontrollable. They think they can fire missiles into a nuclear power's territory, and that the other side will just politely file a complaint with the UN. It is the arrogance of people who have never seen war, who view the world through spreadsheets and polling data. They are playing Russian roulette with a fully loaded gun, convinced that the laws of probability do not apply to them because they went to Ivy League schools. But who pays? Not them. Not the oligarchs in Moscow dining on caviar. Not the lobbyists in DC buying their third vacation home. The price is paid by the Ukrainian teenager freezing in a trench in the Donbass, wondering why the world promised him freedom but gave him only artillery shells. The price is paid by the Russian conscript thrown into a meat grinder for a czar's vanity. The price is paid by the single mother in Berlin who cannot heat her apartment because energy prices have tripled. The price is paid by the global south, by nations in Africa and the Middle East who rely on grain and fertilizer, who are now facing hunger, because the great powers decided to play war games with the world's food supply. This is the cruelty of it. The elites play their games of risk, and the poor pay with their lives and their livelihoods. It is a massive transfer of wealth and blood from the bottom to the top. So where does this go? I am not a prophet, but I am a materialist. I look at the incentives. The US will not allow Ukraine to win decisively, because that risks total nuclear war. But they will not allow Ukraine to lose, because that destroys US credibility. So the goal is the forever war. A grinding, bleeding stalemate. A new Iron Curtain. But this time drawn in blood across the Dnieper. Russia will become increasingly isolated from the West, turning into a resource colony for China. Europe will deindustrialize, becoming a theme park for American tourists and a museum of its former self. And the risk of accident? High. Extremely high. All it takes is one miscalculation, one radar glitch, one commander losing his nerve. We are walking on a razor's edge, blindfolded. This is a bleak picture, I know. But we must face reality to change it. We must reject the binary they force upon us. They tell you if you are not for total war, you are a Putin apologist. This is a lie. It is a lie designed to silence your conscience. You can condemn Putin's invasion and condemn NATO's expansion. You can support the Ukrainian people and demand a diplomatic solution that stops their slaughter. We need a new, non-aligned movement. We need a movement of internationalists who realize that the working class of Russia, the working class of Ukraine, and the working class of America have more in common with each other than they do with their respective leaders. We must demand that our governments stop serving the interests of the military-industrial cloud complex. We must reclaim our agency. Democracy is not just voting every 4 years for the lesser of two evils. Democracy is looking at the abyss and saying, no, we will not jump. The missiles are flying, the rhetoric is heating up. But the power to stop the machine still lies, theoretically, with the people if they can wake up from the trance of propaganda. Do not let them manufacture your consent for World War III. Question everything, follow the money, and never ever let them tell you that peace is impossible. Peace is only impossible for those who profit from war. Thank you, and as always, carpe diem.